Yeah, but you laugh because you're a good guy.
No, filter, I understand the business, you know. Recording, filters. Look funny from the side.
Do you think?
John Lennon once said, "I don't suffer fools gladly, especially musical ones." And he meant it. Forget polite rivalries. Lennon pulled no punches when it came to calling out bands he couldn't stand.
Singing Day in the Life on a guitar and Mal shouting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the breaks, and that's...
Today, we're diving into the shocking, brutally honest list of groups the legendary Beatles openly criticized, from fellow icons to unexpected chart toppers. From disco dynamos to hard rock legends, no genre was safe from Lennon's razor-sharp opinions. Some he mocked, others he obliterated. One even helped break the Beatles apart. Number 1. The Rolling Stones. I think it's a hype. I've always thought Mick was a joke. That wasn't a jealous fan or a scorned critic. That was John Lennon. Despite the Beatles and the Stones being the two biggest bands of the British invasion, Lennon often dismissed the Stones as copycats who followed the Beatles' lead rather than carving their own path. Lennon's disdain wasn't subtle either. In a 1970 Rolling Stone interview, he directly accused the Stones of trailing the Beatles' innovations. "We did SGT Pepper. Then they did their Satanic Majesties." He believed they mimicked everything from album concepts to wardrobe choices. That rivalry wasn't one-sided, either. Mick Jagger often jabbed back in interviews. But while Jagger usually kept things snarky, Lennon's words cut sharper, going as far as calling Jagger insincere and a dancing little man. But here's where it gets deeper. Lennon's critiques weren't just artistic, they were personal. He often viewed the Stones as playing the fame game harder than the Beatles ever did. He criticized Jagger for chasing trends and media attention, which Lennon saw as inauthentic. And in Lennon's eyes, that lack of integrity was worse than making a bad record. It was a betrayal of rock spirit. And yet, despite his contempt, Lennon also occasionally praised individual Stones. He admired Keith Richards' guitar playing, and even recorded with Jagger during the Rock and Roll Circus sessions. But even those collaborations seemed strained, more rooted in industry obligation than genuine chemistry. In private letters and tapes, Lennon doubled down, describing their music as groove deep, soul shallow. There's also a psychological angle. Lennon's contempt may have stemmed from deep-seated insecurity. The Beatles and the Stones were constantly compared in the press, and Lennon hated being lumped into any group. His public persona thrived on being singular and revolutionary, not equal or adjacent. Still, here's the kicker. The Beatles arguably needed the Stones to push boundaries, and vice versa. That mutual pressure bred some of rock's greatest creative explosions. But while McCartney often took a diplomatic tone, Lennon couldn't resist the urge to publicly slice up his peers. Lennon didn't hate the Stones' music. He hated what they represented. Success invites imitation, and imitation ignites ego. Lennon's sharp tongue wasn't just aimed at the music. It was a reaction to seeing himself reflected in competitors he couldn't fully respect. Number 2. The Monkees. Imagine being a Beatle and watching a band formed through a casting call become one of the hottest acts in America. That was John Lennon's reality with the Monkees, and he didn't hold back. He famously called them the Marx Brothers with guitars. A clever jab that, while playful on the surface, masked a deep criticism about authenticity and artistry. The Monkees were assembled in 1965 by American TV producers looking to replicate Beatlemania for television. Lennon immediately saw through the facade. While he occasionally referred to them as funny, he also noted they weren't a real band. That distinction mattered. To Lennon, rock wasn't just about chart positions. It was about struggle, rawness, and rebellion. The Monkees, with their prefab smiles and studio musician support, violated everything he believed real rock should stand for. Yet ironically, Lennon wasn't entirely dismissive in public. He once said, "They're the greatest comic talent since the Marx Brothers," which some fans mistook as praise. But read between the lines, and it's clear. Lennon was reducing them to entertainment, not musicianship. That's a devastating critique from someone who championed artistic evolution. But what stung Lennon even more? The Monkees' success. Their albums outsold the Beatles during 1967, at the peak of psychedelic rock. That likely irked a man who thrived on pushing creative boundaries. Worse, the Monkees didn't even play their instruments on the first two records, something Lennon found unforgivable in a post-Rubber Soul world. And when the Monkees eventually took control of their music, writing and recording tracks like Pleasant Valley Sunday and Daydream Believer, Lennon still wasn't buying it. To him, it was too little, too late. The origin of the band tainted everything that followed. Once you're manufactured, you stay that way, at least in Lennon's worldview. This wasn't just snobbery. It was Lennon defending the sacred idea of music as truth. In his world, authenticity trumped polish every time. And while the Monkees proved themselves as capable musicians in time, Lennon's early judgment remained etched in his public comments and letters. Number 3. Wings. What happens when your former bandmate forms a new band and it tops the charts? If you're John Lennon, you don't clap, you criticize. Wings wasn't just another band to Lennon. It was Paul McCartney's post-Beatles baby, and that alone made it a target. Lennon was deeply skeptical of Wings from the start. He saw it as McCartney's attempt to recapture Beatlemania without the Beatles, and he didn't mince words. In a 1971 interview, Lennon scoffed, "He's just doing music now." He found Wings formulaic, too safe, too polished, the opposite of the raw experimentation Lennon embraced in his solo work. Tracks like Silly Love Songs infuriated him, not just for their lyrics, but for what he believed they represented, a regression into commercial fluff. There was a sense of betrayal, too. Lennon had hoped that post-Beatles, each member would stretch boundaries and redefine music. Instead, he felt Wings was recycling Beatles leftovers, minus the innovation. It didn't help that McCartney avoided political messages or social issues in his lyrics, areas where Lennon was increasingly vocal. In Lennon's mind, Wings wasn't evolving, it was pandering. Privately, his critiques were even harsher. In leaked letters and tapes, Lennon slammed Wings' albums as elevator music and mocked Paul's attempts at being both bandleader and hitmaker. He even went after Linda McCartney, claiming she couldn't sing and questioning why Paul insisted on putting her front and center. "It's nepotism with chords," Lennon reportedly said. But let's be honest, beneath the barbs was bruised ego. Lennon couldn't fully separate the band from the man. Wings' success, especially with hits like Band on the Run, reminded him that McCartney didn't need him to thrive. That stung. Their rivalry, both creative and personal, spilled into their art, with Lennon's "How Do You Sleep?" being a brutal lyrical takedown of Paul's post-Beatles direction. Still, over time, Lennon mellowed. In a 1980 interview, shortly before his death, he admitted, "Paul is doing what he does best." It wasn't an endorsement, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Number 4. Elvis Presley. Here's the twist. John Lennon idolized Elvis, but he also disowned him. That dichotomy tells you everything about how high Lennon set the bar. Elvis wasn't just a singer to John. He was the original blueprint. Lennon famously said, "Before Elvis, there was nothing." So when Lennon turned on him, it wasn't out of hate. It was out of heartbreak. The turning point was Elvis's return from military service in 1960. Gone was the rebellious, dangerous, hip-swinging icon who changed pop forever. In his place stood a clean-cut crooner starring in cheesy Hollywood musicals. Lennon was devastated. He once remarked, "It's like they castrated him." That wasn't just a joke, it was an accusation. Lennon believed the establishment had neutered rock's original rebel, and Elvis let it happen. As Elvis moved deeper into a world of soundtracks, safe lyrics, and white jumpsuits, Lennon became increasingly critical. He saw Elvis as the embodiment of artistic compromise. He stopped being Elvis when he joined the army. Lennon claimed in one interview, even when the Beatles met Elvis in 1965, Lennon reportedly found the encounter awkward and underwhelming. The King didn't jam. He just sat, watched TV, and played a few bass notes. Lennon had built a god in his mind and found a man instead. But there was more to his frustration. In the late 60s, Elvis publicly aligned himself with conservative causes and distanced from the counterculture. Lennon, who was becoming increasingly political and anti-war, saw this as a betrayal. Elvis even visited President Nixon and criticized anti-war protesters, people like John and Yoko. That felt personal. To Lennon, Elvis had gone from revolutionary to reactionary. That wasn't just disappointing, it was dangerous. Still, Lennon never fully revoked his early admiration. Even in his critiques, he acknowledged the seismic influence Elvis had. But the bitterness in his voice when discussing Elvis's decline was undeniable. He didn't just hate the music, he hated what the music became. Number 5. Deep Purple. When asked about hard rock's emerging giants in the early 70s, John Lennon didn't bite his tongue. His target? Deep Purple. He referred to their music as a noisy mess and oral punishment, dismissing their brand of high-octane rock as screaming without soul. To Lennon, Deep Purple wasn't elevating rock, they were cheapening it. It's easy to see why Lennon bristled. As the pioneer of melodic experimentation, Lennon favored songwriting depth over sheer volume. Deep Purple, with their aggressive guitar riffs and thunderous drumming, were spearheading a genre Lennon had little patience for, proto-heavy metal. Where Lennon saw music as a vehicle for message and emotion, he believed Deep Purple was replacing purpose with distortion. In interviews, he dismissed them as technically impressive but spiritually empty. That's a scathing judgment from someone who believed simplicity could be more profound than virtuosity. Deep Purple's sprawling solos and high-octane performances left Lennon cold. He thought it was more about showing off than saying something meaningful. But the conflict wasn't just musical, it was philosophical. Lennon was transitioning into a politically charged, activist artist in the 70s. Songs like Imagine and Working Class Hero were quiet weapons of ideology. Deep Purple, on the other hand, didn't preach, they rocked. Their themes were apolitical, abstract, and often fantastical. That detachment from real-world issues felt hollow to Lennon, who saw music as a means of provoking change, not just evoking headbanging. Yet it wasn't all personal bitterness. Lennon understood that music evolves, he just didn't like the direction. To him, Deep Purple represented a new chapter of rock that prioritized decibels over direction. He once joked, "It's music for people who hate lyrics," mocking what he saw as shallow thematic repetition. Still, Deep Purple's fans would argue the opposite. Songs like Child in Time carry weight, and their live musicianship was undeniably pioneering. But Lennon never budged. He once referred to their iconic Smoke on the Water riff as an endless loop of blandness, another jab at what he saw as commercial overkill masked as rebellion. Number 6. The Bee Gees. Now here's a feud soaked in irony. John Lennon, the master of reinvention, absolutely loathed the Bee Gees' transformation. Once a Baroque pop act with soft harmonies, the Bee Gees embraced disco in the late 70s and conquered the world. Lennon, though, he saw their rise as the death knell of real music. He was particularly savage during the disco boom. When asked about the Bee Gees' success in the Saturday Night Fever era, Lennon quipped, "It's not music, it's deodorant with a beat." That wasn't a jab, that was a full-on body slam. Lennon viewed disco as synthetic, and the Bee Gees were its most glamorous messengers. But it wasn't just a genre, it was the perceived inauthenticity. Lennon believed the Gibb brothers had sold their soul for strobe lights and sequins. The transition from poetic ballads like Massachusetts to glitter-drenched bangers like Stayin' Alive left Lennon cold. He felt they abandoned artistry for marketability, chasing trends instead of setting them. In a private letter uncovered years later, Lennon referred to them as the step-forward wives of pop, suggesting their polished sound was robotic and soulless. He couldn't reconcile their earlier, Lennon-approved music with the flashy falsettos and disco theatrics of the late 70s. And while disco was already polarizing, Lennon's take added intellectual disdain to the cultural backlash. The Bee Gees, for their part, never fired back publicly, but one has to wonder if they felt the sting. Being rejected by one of music's greatest lyricists, a man who helped redefine pop, isn't a light critique, especially when it wasn't just your sound, but your integrity being questioned. Oddly enough, both Lennon and the Bee Gees had incredible range. They evolved, experimented, adapted. But Lennon believed evolution without authenticity was betrayal. He respected risk, but only when it was rooted in truth. To him, the Bee Gees were brilliant craftsmen who started building for the wrong audience. Love him or hate him, John Lennon never bit his tongue. He didn't believe in softening his opinions for the sake of industry friendship, because to him, music was sacred. It had to be honest, purposeful, and soul-deep. And when it wasn't, he called it out, loud and clear. From the Stones to the Bee Gees, Lennon's dislikes weren't random. They reflected a philosophy that real art can't be fabricated, faked, or manufactured to sell. Some of the bands he hated became legends anyway. Others faded, but his critiques remain a window into the mind of one of music's most fearless truth-tellers. So next time someone tells you music is just taste, remember, for Lennon, it was a revolution. Want to know which artists Lennon actually loved? Hit subscribe. That one's coming next.